with vicissitudes, Golas is going to bring you, don't forget you have within you, each and every member of Klal Yisrael has within itself the ability to shine forth and to be leaders and to show the way, just as the North Star is the paradigm of guidance even before they had magnetic compasses and things like that. It was the North Star that was going to be the leader, the direction, and help wanderers find their way home. So too Klal Yisrael, the spark and sparkle in your neshama is going to help you find your way home, especially apropos during this week of Shabbos Chazayim, the 9 days, when Klal Yisrael can sometimes falter, when we're called on to be mechazik ourselves, and we're called on to embrace the idea of Geula in a time when we're experiencing the most bitter Golus, and we're recalling the most bitter Golus, to tell you that the Golus is always only just a prelude to the Geula Be'ez Hashem B'Korah. As the Rav mentioned, the topic that I would like to discuss with you is dairy stuff, milk stuff. Milk is a shtickle, a phenomenon in that it's a contradiction, really, because we know there's a halacha that something that is a yotz min achai is not kosher. By definition, by normal halachic criteria, it's a Gemara B'Cheres. It asks us, hello, what are you doing with drinking milk? You can't drink milk because the cow is an ein zavuach. Until the cow is shechted, it's not a tmeya, but it's not kosher. You can't go over and take a bite out of a cow. A cow is not kosher until it's geshachten. That means that this milk manufacturing machine is an ein zavuach, and it's not kosher. And by the way, there are instances where this is a critical idea. The idea of ein zavuach, the Gemara, when there's machlekes, there's a whole sugi of machzakinim min iser iser. We know that something is something that has a cheskas iser remains usher until you know that it has been changed. With the Gemara, it tosses around the idea that since a cow is an ein zavuach, it may in fact have a cheskas iser, and you may have to prove that it's kosher. You see, the Gemara starts off saying that if the cow is the cheskas iser, that means anything that's yosim in the iser is iser. So the Gemara Mecharis talks about, so how can you drink milk? So the Gemara goes through various permutations, one of which it says that when the Torah tells you, promises you, it's an eretz zovas cholav udvash. If the Rebbe Shalom is promising Klal Yisrael as one of the milos of Eretz Yisrael, one of the promissory benefits of where they're going is going to be a land which is going to be with milk, and it's especially noted in the bracha of an Yehuda when Moshe is going to get bracha. So therefore, it must be that cholav is kosher. But there are certain times, for instance, if a person were to shech the cow and then go and milk the udder, then milk is not kosher. That milk is not kosher. Just as if I think we just mentioned in the daf a couple of blocks back, where it talks about if you shecht a chicken, there's I'm going to get sidetracked. This is fascinating. When you pull open chickens, they have what's called the eshkol habesim, which is hanging off the spine. It's called an eshkol because it looks just like a cluster of grapes, where you have eggs in various stages of development, from mamish, a little yellow spot, to fully formed eggs, which are mu'ura eaten, ready to be born. And we know the Gemara Bay says that an egg that is laid is really fully formed from the day before. That means that you literally have an entire panoply of eggs in various stages. And it's the same thing. So just as those, however, if you open a chicken, if the chicken's kosher, these eggs are fleshes. That means that if you pull out one of those eggs and you're Sephardi, you're putting it chilled, so it's okay. But if you're thinking to make scrambled eggs from 9 days, you've got a problem, because it retains the state of what it is, and therefore, if you milk in the vela, aside from being very gross, it's not going to be kosher. So milk is in itself an interesting topic. The physical makeup of milk is fascinating, because milk, I'm not going to have any question and answer, but usually at this point I ask people in an audience what color milk is, and of course everybody says it's white. Actually, there are different phases of, you went to school, right? Chemistry, there are solid phases and liquid phases. The liquid phase of milk is yellow. It's a pale, translucent yellow, and that is called whey. The white that you see is the casein, is the protein that is in solution in the whey. There's a lot of casein, so it doesn't. And as a matter of fact, when you make cheese, and what you do is you fill a tank about almost the size of this room. You fill it with about 3 feet high, and you pour in a couple of cups of rennet. And what the rennet does is it separates out, it slices out the solid phase from the liquid phase, and the casein. The solids drift down, the yellowish liquid floats on top, you drain that off, and you have the solids of cheese. So you have a solid casein component that is what becomes the cheese. The yellow liquid is drawn off. You have in there, you have other stuff in the casein. You also have cream and all these things that get separated out. Now, here is at one point in time, Chazal, when they were making a number of gezeres, and the specific purposes of the gezeres that the Chacham instituted was to create a hevdil between Klal Yisrael and their neighbors, because Chazal at that time the idea of Golus was remarkably raw. It was nascent then, because they really hadn't gone to Golus. They hadn't been chased from place to place. The Churban Bayis Rishon, everybody went to Bavel. Everybody was together. First, you had the leaders of Klal Yisrael, the Cherish, the Mazgir and the Cherish were brought down there. The Hashgacha sent them to prepare, so that when the rest of Klal Yisrael came down there, they were already yeshivas, they were about the midrashim, they were about the knesiyas. There was a communal infrastructure, and Klal Yisrael came there. They were there for 7 years. They were so comfortable that when Ezra, 70 years later, when Ezra said, "Okay, boys, it's time to go back to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash," there were fewer people. Everybody thinks today, "Oh, Mashiach's going to come. Everybody's going to pack up, leave your, Lexus and your Teslas and your houses, and we're rolling after Israel." There were fewer people that accompanied Ezra back to build the Bayis Sheni than are sitting in the bleachers in Citi Field on a Blazer Tuesday. There were 10,000 people. They said 30,000 people. But Lamaisa, it was a knot of people because they were very comfortable. They were there. They were Eingevart, so there wasn't an impression. The Golus of Bavel that Chazal, that was Chazal's experience of Golus. Good, so then they had the Bayis Sheni, and they said, the Romans, the Greeks, whatever you can do. But there were tough times coming. And Chazal knew that in order to separate Klal Yisrael from the Umas Ha'olam, you had to institute safeguards, and the way, just like the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. That means that if you're not going to be able to share meals, no matter how many buddy you'll go bowling together, you go fishing together, but when it's time to have a drink, you're not going to have a drink. People don't realize, they think that when they go for business meetings, they go to a bar. You're not allowed to. This is one of the accepted desires. We're not going to get to that tonight. About sharing alcoholic beverages in a place where alcoholic beverages are poured is also in its own right. But one of the things that they instituted was something called Cholav Akum. Cholav Akum has a number of reasons, and as a matter of fact, when the Gemara in the Mishnah that discusses this, when it's Hesilu Davrach, it's Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, the Mefarshim in the Mishnah says it's very, very obscure Mishnah. He brings in from Shir Shirim. He says Doidayach, Doidecha. What is it? What the Gemara really means is to say, don't go looking for reasons. I can tell you that I saw Ksav from the Friedrich Klosenberg Rebbe, which is Chronal Bracha, that he said that his Zayda, the Divrei Chaim told him that before he fears Zayin a minig in Sands, he says it was over 100. I don't like to just toss out numbers. I know it was well over 100. I think it was like 120. But it's certainly well over 100 reasons beniglu benister before he fears Zayin a minig. So if the different Chaim could think of things that way, Chazal certainly had a multifaceted idea on what they did and why they did it. And the reason that they hadn't called Yisrael, I think, however you're going to permutate it, it boils down to today. And today we know that there are 3 famous shuvas in the Igros Mesha that everybody quotes, or everybody they lean on when they say that they're not Matan Michal Yisrael. First of all, just as a Ben Torah, to say the words out of your mouth, I'm not Matan Michal Yisrael. You go over to Kuf Tesvav and you're just like rip that page out. It doesn't. If you say that I'm Mekel, I'm Samech on certain days is one thing, but to say I'm not Matan Michal Yisrael is the same thing as saying that if I wish I had a chicken cheeseburger, because a chicken cheeseburger is also only Gzeir Drabanan. So, if you're going to dispense with the Xeris Rabbanon, if you're a little broader in your dispensing, you can have a whole slew of them that are not Negea. So, in fact, there's no such thing as not being Mak Nechol Yisrael. What you can do is try to understand those Paiskim who have a what do they call it? A write out where there's a certain thing. Exemptions. Thank you. In 1965, when the second chelik of the Yichezkel came out, the first chelik part of it, and where the tshuva came out about company milk, where Rabbi was I was actually very, very excited because I was in yeshiva in Boston there. And now Boston is a big town. They have chel, they have zedek. Then it was like 0.00. It was nothing. It was, so we saw the tshuva, and I called Rabbi and said, "It's impossible to even fantasize anymore. You used to be able to go to a phone booth and call a number, and Rabbi finally would pick up the phone and say, yeah, and you'd be able to talk to the gadol in the door and ask him shilas." So I squeezed into a phone booth. Phone booth, by the way, they had like a phone on the wall. We put in like quarters and nickels and things. And we called, everybody knew Ramesh's number. And I said that, we just saw the tshuva. So he says, yeah, how can I help you? So I said, well, I'm here in yeshiva in Boston. So Ramesh is obviously as big as it, they say over that Reb Chaim Soloveitchik was such a lamdan that entirely covered up what a big tzaddik he was, and the Chafetz Chaim was such a big tzaddik that it totally obscured what a Talmud Chacham was. Ramesh's godless, his Avos Yisrael was, he was stricken with, the Bachim don't have food, it was going to come running up himself to feed us. So he said, no, we have some milk for coffee and breakfast. So he said, so what's your problem? So of course I wanted to dig a hole, and I said, ice cream and candy? So he says, no. He says, this tshuva was written for people that live far away from centers of Jewish population where you have access to Chol Yisrael, and they have young children that need milk for their health and for growth. So that's why this is a limud schus, and that's what it says, that's what it was written for. So, I just feel that since it's personally happened to me, I'm the carrier of this message. I just want you to know that usually people that say, oh, the Igros Moshe is there, the Reb Moshe was matter, Reb Moshe was not matter. Reb Moshe, because his Avos Yisrael felt it necessary to work out a reasonable basis for people that have no access to Chol Yisrael, that they should be able to have access to something. That's just one thing I wanted to share with you. Now, going forward, but certainly for people that the Rabbanim have been blessed, and I can tell you that for Baruch Hashem, for only a short while, I had a small shul in Muncie when we lived there, and I can tell you from personal experience, Rabbanim, Erlich Rabbanim, have a certain around siyat d'shmaya that when people ask them shalos and hadracha, there is a certain siyat d'shmaya that the Rebbeinu Shalom gives them. So each of you can ask your Rav for guidance, halachic guidance, hashkafic guidance, your children, and things like that. But I just wanted to share this with you. There is a phenomenon that's coming up right now. It's coming, and it's not only looming. It's been looming on the horizon for the last 10 years, but now it's right here. That there's such a thing called parva milk. Now, not the parva milk that everybody's used to, that gloppy, coconut oil, this stuff that you feel it in your mouth for 2 weeks. I'm talking about they have what is called is something called pinpoint fermentation, and they've developed this more and more over the last 10 years. And interestingly enough, Eretz Yisrael is very much in the forefront of this science. And what they do is there are two totally different ways of approaching this. One is the meat that's made without cows, and we'll get to that later if we have time. But that's made totally different, and that is a real problem in halacha, because in order to do a good fermentation, they need live cells, and they actually extract live cells out of a cow, and that is shayla ve'evim nechai. And they take a hollow tube and they press it into the cow and they extract living cells, and the living cells are what they multiply in the fermentation tanks. So that's evim nechai. We'll get to it. But milk, it did entirely differently. What they did was there's something called DNA. I'm sure you've all heard of that. Now, DNA, every cell that you have, and you have trillions of cells, every cell has wrapped up in it this code that controls who you are, what you are, and these type of things. So if you know how, you can extract the DNA strand, you unravel it, and you can identify the different characters, the different processes that the body is going to go through that are encoded in that DNA. As a matter of fact, the very first gene splice, it's called gene splicing, the very first gene splice that they did, they tried to introduce it on retail level, was a horrible failure, because they know that when you take tomatoes and you freeze them, in order to get tomatoes only come out once a year, but you people want tomatoes all year. So they were trying to various ways how to make sure they can stay in cold storage, whatever. So they said that there's a fish called the Arctic char. It happens to be kosher. And it happens to not have anisakis. But the Arctic char is totally impervious to cold water. No matter how, that's why it lives in the Arctic. And no matter how cold the water gets, it's totally impervious to the water. So they took the Arctic char and they took the cells and they unraveled it until they were able to find the genes specifically that made it impervious to cold, and they took those genes and they implanted it into the genes of the tomato. And they thought people were very happy to have frost-proof tomatoes, but people, they had to advertise, because since it was, at that time, it was very young, the science of gene splicing, so the FDA said you have to advertise, so they had to advertise, these tomatoes contain genes from fish, and they weren't able to give them away. But it's come a long way since then, and what the scientists have done is they've been able to isolate, deny the parts of the genes of milk that express the proteins of the casein and the protein of the cream and the exact makeup. They've been able to chemically duplicate the lactose and the other things that make up the yellow, the whey, and things like that. They combine it, and none of this has anything to do with the original milk, because they have chemically synthesized everything that the genes do, and they have now, what they do is that once they have that gene, they implant it into a yeast or into a bacteria, and then they multiply that in a fermentation tank. They just take and you see this, the way these things work, the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world is obvious. Anytime if your wife is making, and everybody I know this, I think it's a new law, you have to make sourdough bread at least once a week. And when you walk in, as the stuff is fermenting, your kitchen smells like a brewery. And the reason for that is because the way that yeast works, yeast eats sugar, they eat carbohydrates, and it excretes carbon dioxide. Now that's what makes the little bubbles in the reason that you have matzah is very flat and bread is very, very puffy is because they put yeast in your bread, and that constantly, as it eats the sugars in the carbohydrates in the flour, it creates carbon dioxide, and all those little bubbles are filled with carbon dioxide. They bake it off, and there you go. So what they do is they take yeast or bacteria, they implant it with this gene, and they ferment it, and it produces all these proteins, these milk proteins. They centrifuge it out, and voila, they have milk. So you run into a whole new slew of shilas here. First of all, there's a halacha b'Chol Yisrael that is fascinating. Machlekes between the Ramah and the Shach. The Ramah seems to indicate that by Chol Yisrael you have to be Yisrael Re'ehu. It has to be Yisrael watching it. Now, the next step, what they were guys wrong, by the way, which nobody is matir, is Gvina Zakum, which means that if a guy takes Chol Yisrael and kosher rennet and mixes it up, and he tells his friend, his yankel next door, hey, look what I made you for your party. I made you soft mozzarella cheese. Everybody knows you want pizza, and you don't know how to make soft mozzarella, and my name's Antonio, so I know how to make soft mozzarella. And he goes in, it's not kosher. It's called Gvinas Akum. And he says, no, I swear, and he shows him the bottles of Chol Yisrael. Doesn't make a difference. Gvinas is so. The Ramah says that a Yid has to watch the Gvina, the cheese making. The Shach says, it brings it's a huge Shach, where he comes down, he says that a Yid has to be physically involved in the actual making of the cheese. So the question is that only the Gvina? How about over here? Do you have to have a Yid involved in making of this milk? Does this have a milk? Is milk, and granted, the last few blots in the daf, where it's talking about if you have a cow that gives birth, or it has a fetus which has non-cloven hooves, right? And you know that one of the simonim of something that's kosher is it has to be mafresis parsha. It has to have a split hoof. Now that means that the Gemara says that it's not the split hoof that does it, because you see that if it's inside the mother, even if it doesn't have a split hoof, it's kosher. And you have other things with the insects, with the bugs, right? If it's not sheretz ala aretz, if it develops its entire life inside the fruit, and it's never sheretz ala aretz, it's not awesome. So you say, what do you mean? You take up two bugs and you hold them up together. They're exactly identical. They're brothers. This one happened to be a wild guy, so he ran outside and he was flying around and he's sheretz ala aretz. So that's awesome. This one I can have in my chong. So you see that the halacha sometimes it transcends what you would ordinarily assume to be so. So over here also, so this milk, it is impossibly, if you had to take a spectrogram and you try to decide which one is the real milk, which one's the fake milk, you can't toss them because chemically they are exactly identical. So does that make it milk? Does it make it milchik? Or do you say, no, because when the pasuk says the Easter of basar b'chalav, lesavashal gedi b'chalevi moed. This is not chalevi moed. This is not milk that came from a mother. So let's say it doesn't. So there was a interesting, and it goes more further. You guys don't remember this, but when they first came out with the dairy creamers for the one or two hashgachos still insist, but everybody at that time insisted that they actually had to have that at the end of the chasana when they served the coffee. It's not enough to have a little pitcher with the power of milk in it. You had to actually have it. Why? Because the Gemara says there's something called meish gedim. This almond milk is not a new idea. We've had it around for a couple thousand years. But the Gemara says that since in order for Asmaras Ayin, you're supposed to have the shkedim, and it's not enough to have a sign on the door. By the way, we only serve carved milk. It says that the mei shkedim have to be floating. The shkedim particles of the almond have to actually be floating in the mei shkedim, in the almond milk, in order for it to be relieved of the problem of Maras Ayin. So they said by the way, there's an incidental, a similar machlekes. So it's the Gemara. The Gemara says, it asers milk bread. It means bread that is made with the milk ingredient. It's also to make it, except for there are three carve-outs that you are allowed to make it. But so at one point in time, one of the hashgachas following the psak of law once said that if on the outside of the wrapper it says dairy, that's enough of a simon. It's very rare to do that. So because it would clear from the Gemara and from the halacha that the simon that breaks the Maras Ayin has to be part of the problem that's being manufactured, being made. So over here also. So what do you do with this milk in order to prove it? This is still, they're chewing these things out. It's just not first within the last few weeks or for a few months that it's come to the market. There's one in Eretz Yisrael with it does not have. There's one in America. There is this make-believe milk, this manufactured milk that has the OU and it's OU parv, and it has in it has the thing. And then the question is also, since this milk can duplicate regular milk in its character, you can make cheese out of it. Does the gezerah of Gvinas Akum only apply to milk that's made into cheese? This is milk. If it's not milk and it's parv, you can manufacture whatever you want with it. Maybe it doesn't. They didn't Gvinas Akum. These are things that are still out to lunch, and the place can still meeting each other up.
But you gave it hechsher?
Though we gave a hechsher on the milk. Yeah.
To buy in the stores here?
I'm sorry?
To buy in the stores here?
I don't know how they're marketing it, so I don't know where they're marketing it. I would imagine they probably got some tree huggers in Oregon that are buying this, to save the cows. But but you have to drink milk. You have to drink chemistry. Now they don't do it. Everybody's busy with phones. When I was a kid, every kid. Do you know that when I was a kid, every house in the United States was within 5 miles of a Radio Shack? And people actually did things like you'd play with science games and things like that. Every kid had a chemistry kit, and then you make stuff and you drink it. So that's what you end up with. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Are there any questions?
So you can have fleshig milk technically.
If
you took the milk after the cow died, and it's fleshig milk.
Yeah. Well, except that then it wouldn't be kosher at all. Because, technically it'll be fleshig, but since it never passed that bar of heter, of being milked while it was alive. So I don't think that anything is the cow. It's part of the cow, and you have to specifically the Gemara makes a special way of koshering that instead of the regular way of koshering meat, where you soak it, you salt it, and you soak it. The cow, you have to be kairish esavier. You have to rip it open. You have to slim it. You have to make sure to express all that milk, so there shouldn't be anything that left.
You were with this fake milk. What about if I want to fry schnitzel? I want to soak it in milk first. I want to make KFC. Is that allowed? My house. I'm not selling.
Yeah, I got it. That's the Rabbi is going to have to do that one. As when it becomes available.
Does it provide guidance on this, or they just said it's kosher and moved on?
That's a good question. I can give you the OU has an answer line where you can call in with questions. 212-613-8241.
They don't think the lab-grown meat is kosher?
The lab-grown meat. Lab-grown meat is a totally different thing. That's a whole problem.
Does anyone give it a hechsher?
At this point, they're still writing shuvas.
Writing shuvas.
They're still what?
I think lab-grown eggs is kosher, right?
The what one?
The lab-grown eggs.
I didn't know that one. Eggs? I know they have a substitute for eggs. They have an egg substitute. So I'm not sure. But I'm just simply not. I'm not familiar.
Is the issue with the lab-grown meat that they're taking the cells from live animal, or if they took the cells from a dead animal?
So that is what they were trying to get some firm middle ground where they would harvest the cells from a shechuta, which is kosher, so you avoid the problem of egg minachai. But the problem is that you can't just take it raw. You can use raw meat. Right, as Gemara says that's old Gemara Bay about if you have a misakenis, you can shaft it, even though some of the chesek, as long as you can take something from the base of shita, you can take it and eat it raw. So the question is the first deal with it, but you have to kasher, you have to make it down. So you have to broil it. If meat can be made kosher, then it can be made blood free. You shaft it, that makes it kosher. But you have to extract the dam. You have 72 hours to extract the dam. If you don't extract the dam within 72 hours, the only thing you can do to it is broil it, because the broiling draws out. And by the way, they said chop liver literally because, Marshall, if let's say you have some people that are not with that, right? And when I was working with MPGS, if we could not get the liver broiled within 72 hours, just dump it in the garbage. Other people will do that, and it's a shvera machlekes poskim whether you can then cook it. Does the broiling that you do after 72 hours draw out the blood that there's nothing there, or it sets it that it's no longer considered blood and you can use it as it is broiled? You can grind it then, but you can't saute it.
Because then
it'll come back again. So that's not saying. So over here,
take out the cells, so that can kill the cells.
Yeah, that's the problem. In other words, you have what? Okay, that's okay.
All the labs
Yes, he was learning that.
If you did it during the
If
9
you
days.
remember cool, who cares what
If you
you
did it during the 9 days.
I'm saying, but once you go in Bambakur, just make a whole flock of Bambakur.
No, but this is going commercially. You go to the store and buy this fake meat.
The whole reason why lab grown is enticing for Jews is because we don't have any more trips anymore, right? So the cost goes down. So we're going to street the cost. If you had one Bambakur, just make a whole flock of Bambakur. You just need one, right? You need two now.
Well, you need two.
You need two, which is not
And
that
you have to do it
much.
dangerously.
And then that's it. Good to go. No more.
But that's the problem. The problem that they're faking right now is, aside from setting aside the before, is as a matter of fact, because if you have to prepare the cells to be able to harvest it, by the time you do it, you beat it up really good. There's very little viability left in the cells to produce. So that's what that problem is.
What about dairy equipment? Is there more markets to be made over there?
So
Like
here's the
dairy.
shadow. And one of the things I found fascinating working at the OU, probably 80% of the stuff at the OU is dairy. But in spite of the fact that they obviously hold that it's heter and therefore the kalim are not the hetera, which is mutter. They, in consideration of the people that are matan chodesh and the confusion that the Yichezkel, if it wasn't par, if it was used for dairy and it was not kosher, it was considered dairy. Period.
So-
in order to be considered par, you had to kosher it. If you didn't kosher it, even if it was an ein ben yomim, even if it wasn't kosher, it was the OU would mark it as dairy. Now, unfortunately, this may come as a shock, but there's a lot of money in kashrus. And the other agencies, the Kuf K, the OK, the Star K, they had divisions that do DE, and the OU is losing market share because they were still for years they held fast to their principle of marking it dairy if it's not par. And it was last year or two they started moving in allowing DE as a designation. Now what that means, and you're going to have to speak to the Rabbi about this. Here's the short form. I'm sorry. Here's the short form of what the problem is. When you're dealing with tarevis, if you have nice and tam, when you cook something, you take something and you cook it. Now this pot, which you cook, let's talk with the color covered. You take chazer, you cook it in this pot, you say, oh my goodness, what did I do? This is my shalom bag. You pour it out, you wash it out with soap and water, it's still treif. Because the blias, what's ever absorbed into this keli, is considered treif. And therefore, the next thing that comes out, whatever was balua, whatever was absorbed, is now polat, it now exudes into the content of this pot. And the Rabbanan said that not bernat, nois and tam, making a blia, bar nois and tam, when it comes back out, is awesome. And that means not bernat of isura. Not bernat of hetera is mutter. So now, if you hold that non-chol yisrael, call company milk, call whatever you want, is heter me'ikra din, so it means it's not bernat hetera. And so somebody told me that his uncle and aunt were next door neighbors with Rav Moshe in the country. And his aunt once went in to Reb Feinstein to borrow a parva pot. So she goes in and said, "Can I have a parva pot?" Just 1 second. This is the flesh pot. No, I haven't used it in 24 hours. It's not any ben. This is a parva pot. I mean, in Reb Moshe's house, a parva pot was a not the hetera. That was lechatchila. That's the halacha. People don't do that anymore, and it's not a great idea because you're going to get confused. You can forget when it was used, it wasn't used. So people have parva pots, but so going back to your question, if you hold that non-chol Yisrael is really the ikra din mutter, so you have not that there. So it's simple. So you're not going to eat it with meat. You can't cook. You can't cook a pot of water and then use that to make chicken soup with. But it's not going to make you flesh. It's not going to make you milk. It's neutral in that time. Don't tell them I told you so. But it's much like this place where they have to kasher. Kalim, how far it goes. Mushal. Reb Moshe writes. He says the chol akum is a Isa Drabonin. It's the lashon that he uses. He says an Isa Drabonin she'ain ikra min the and therefore. Even though, let's say you have a pot that was used for Easter, you have to wait till it's an Ein Ben Yoimei. After it's an Ein Ben Yoimei, anything that's absorbed is considered pogum because of the time that's passed. So usually you can't kasher until after it's pogum. But Moshe says that since it's a xeric cow, because of that you can kasher twice. Once with davar pogum, once kashering, that's good enough, even if it's Ben Yoimei. So there are certain coolest, certain squiggle, certain wiggle room, and will be conscious.
With OU's policy that they don't do OUD, they say OUD. If I look at something and I look at the ingredients and I see that it's now algebra, it does not say potato, and I assume that it's OUD.
No, because muscle, if you have a flavor, not everything's going to be an allergy with dairy. For instance, casein is the difference between allergies and you have an allergy is to a protein. If you have, let's say, if you just simply don't, it doesn't get along with lactose, intolerance. That's the word. If you have an intolerance to other proteins, but to have a full-blown allergy, you need protein. So let's say if something doesn't have casein, but it has, let's say, lactose, they're using now a belt of medicinal pills, things like that, are made with lactose. The lactose is
something
the
could
sugar.
be dairy and not show an allergy.
Yeah.
You can't eat that as matrix?
What?
those PE products.
Well, doesn't matter, this is the question, so this is like the.
I was at BE, they asked for the question, and the Oreos are all you can eat, either with flavor.
I heard a lot of that.
Well, that's because.
These goals are measured, they're measured, if we're not about anything, losses in Missouri,
That's why I brought that. Yeah, that. I'm saying, well, that's not a clear, it's not a clear. There you go.